If you came here looking for encouragement, this isn't going to give it to you. This video isn't designed to comfort you or wrap your experience in something reassuring. It exists to expose a pattern most people refuse to face, because once you recognize it, it changes how you see everything. You weren't overlooked because you lacked value. You were overlooked because you were dependable. You answered quickly, so waiting became your default state. When messages were read and left hanging, you didn't push back, you paused. You filled the silence with excuses for them, busy, distracted, overwhelmed. Anything that avoided the obvious conclusion. Over time, you taught them that access to you had no cost. And that's how relevance erodes quietly, without anyone consciously choosing to disrespect you. Think about how often you stayed reachable while shrinking inside. How many times your phone stayed close, sound on, attention ready, even while pretending you were unaffected. Imagine a space you usually occupy. Then remove yourself from it one day, the seat empty, no questions asked, the conversation flowing as if nothing changed. That realization doesn't arrive loudly, it arrives softly. And that's what makes it sting. Here's the inversion most people resist. People don't miss you because you were there. They miss you because of what being there made easy for them. This is the real price of becoming invisible. The fatigue didn't come from being attacked. It came from constantly protecting everyone else from discomfort while absorbing it yourself. You weren't worn down by arguments. You were worn down by stopping them before they ever started. You didn't escalate situations. You diluted them. You didn't speak louder. You asked for less. Whenever tension surfaced, you moved toward it first, reframed it, softened it, carried the emotional load so no one else had to sit with unease. You slid into the role of peacemaker without ever choosing it. You were the one who reached out after silence, the one who checked in, the one who said, "I understand," even when the situation was clearly unequal. What drains you most is that this wasn't demanded of you. You offered it, quietly, because maintaining connection felt safer than risking space. So irritation became something you swallowed and labeled growth. Neglect became something you reinterpreted as empathy. You adjusted your standards downward and convinced yourself it was enough. Think about how often you acted as the emotional cushion, the shock absorber, the place where bad moods, unclear signals, last-minute cancellations, and half apologies could land without consequence. That exhaustion didn't come from chaos. It came from disappearing inside yourself. You didn't break down visibly. You thinned out slowly. And no one apologizes for that kind of harm, because it doesn't look like damage. It looks like you're easy to be around, flexible, undemanding. But something was being drained every time you chose patience instead of truth, access instead of dignity. This is the realization most people never reach. You weren't too much. You were too available. And access without limits doesn't create closeness. It creates entitlement. What you felt earlier wasn't a weakness in your character. It was the natural outcome of how power actually operates between people. And this is where Machiavelli becomes relevant. He wasn't cruel, and he wasn't advocating revenge or manipulation disguised as strategy. He was describing a reality most people only recognize after they've been emptied by it. People don't value what they can completely control. They depend on it. Dependence feels comfortable, but it slowly erodes respect. The boundary of access is where value begins. Machiavelli understood that power exists in the mind before it ever shows up in action. It's shaped by perception, not by generosity or explanation. When something is constantly available, the brain stops tracking its worth. Consider something simple, like Wi-Fi. When it's working, it barely registers. The instant it goes out, routines break and irritation sets in. Not because you care about Wi-Fi emotionally, but because your system was built around it. Relationships follow the same rule. Constant presence produces reliance without regard. Chosen absence, by contrast, produces awareness without conflict. You don't need to argue to be felt. You don't need to explain to be noticed. Power doesn't live in being there. It lives in what can no longer be reached. When distance creates clarity, confrontation usually undoes it. And this is where most people unknowingly surrender the last bit of leverage they had. You were conditioned to believe that speaking up is healthy, that expressing how you feel leads to mutual understanding, that saying it the right way will finally trigger change. But confrontation only functions when your value is already acknowledged. And if you're listening to this, that acknowledgement was never present. When you speak, they don't pause to examine themselves. They move to manage the situation. They tell you why you're interpreting things incorrectly. They wrap the moment in language that sounds gentle but requires no adjustment. I didn't mean it. You're reading too much into it. That wasn't my intention. These phrases aren't meant to fix behavior. They're meant to settle you. You walk away briefly relieved, tension dissolved, believing something shifted. And then time passes and nothing is different. The cycle restarts because confrontation gave them exactly what they needed. Relief without cost. You invested effort, explanation, and another opportunity, while they offered soothing words and nothing else. That's why confronting someone who undervalues you drains you instead of strengthening you. You aren't drawing boundaries. You're bargaining for worth with someone who benefits from keeping it discounted. Think about how often you rehearsed your needs, softened your tone, avoided sounding excessive, only to arrive back at the same outcome. Here's the hard turn most people resist. This video isn't about helping you communicate better or feel more understood. It's here to show you why understanding without leverage produces no change, and why being heard never kept you safe. If this feels uncomfortably accurate, don't move on yet. Notice who surfaced in your mind and stay. Because what comes next explains why leaving succeeds where every explanation fails. Explanation brings comfort. Absence brings consequences. After people grasp the idea of absence, this is usually where they undo it. They confront, and in doing so, they quietly return every ounce of power they just reclaimed. You were raised to believe that speaking openly is healthy, that naming your feelings creates clarity, that once everything is said out loud, the other person will finally adjust. But confrontation only works when respect already exists. And if you spent any time being overlooked, that respect was never there. When you speak, nothing actually shifts. They don't change course, they contain the moment. They explain why your interpretation is off. They cushion the tension with language that sounds considerate, but asks nothing of them. I didn't mean it. You're overthinking. That wasn't my intention. These lines aren't meant to correct behavior. They're meant to settle you. You leave the conversation feeling briefly relieved, tension diffused, convinced something moved forward, and weeks later you realize you're standing in the exact same place. This is the loop this video is meant to break. It's not here to help you communicate more effectively or express yourself more clearly. It exists to expose why clarity without leverage produces no change, and why being understood never kept you protected. You're not here to learn how to persuade someone to value you. You're here to see why persuasion was the mistake from the beginning. Confrontation offers reassurance without cost, forgiveness without consequence, and confirmation that you'll remain engaged regardless of outcome. That's why confronting someone who undervalues you leaves you depleted instead of stronger. You aren't enforcing boundaries. You're bargaining your worth with someone who profits from keeping it low. Explanation provides comfort. Absence delivers consequence. When confrontation fails, silence doesn't just appear, it takes over. And that's when the first real shock begins. Not grief, not regret, disorientation. Nothing explodes when you disappear. Nothing dramatic announces itself. Their system simply stops running the way it always did. You weren't only someone they cared about. You were a mechanism inside their routine. You absorbed tension without protest. You responded on cue. You steadied emotions. You eliminated friction before it ever surfaced. When that mechanism is removed, the structure depending on it destabilizes. They open your chat automatically, muscle memory guiding their hand, expecting the familiar relief of your presence, and there's nothing. No explanation, no delay, just empty space. The habit activates and meets resistance. The day feels subtly wrong. Conversations drag. Annoyance lingers instead of dissolving. There's no place to unload frustration and feel lighter afterward. No quiet force smoothing edges so life stays seamless. The chaos you once carried now circulates inside them with nowhere to go. That's why sadness hasn't arrived yet. Sadness is emotional. This is operational. People don't panic when something leaves. They panic when something stops working. And you worked. Through access alone, you made their world easier. Without you, everything stretches. Delays feel longer. Emotions reverberate. Problems resurface instead of disappearing. They check again. They refresh. They wait. The system keeps reaching for a resource that no longer exists. This connects directly to what came before, because silence doesn't negotiate like confrontation did. It removes the stabilizer completely. That's the mistake most people make. You didn't exit their feelings. You exited their routine. And once a routine breaks, the mind can't convincingly pretend stability remains. The disturbance shows up in quiet drives, in pauses, in tasks that used to run automatically. Absence introduces friction everywhere at once. They feel slower, less regulated, more exposed to their own reactions. Minor stresses grow heavier without an outlet. This is the first fracture in their sense of control, the moment they recognize that something essential is gone and cannot be replaced. It doesn't shout. It vibrates. Constant, unresolved, impossible to ignore once it begins. And this is only the opening movement of what silence sets in motion. None of it is random. It follows rules you were never taught. Until now. Once the routine breaks, the mind doesn't grieve. It scrambles. Silence turns inward, and the repair process begins in a way they can't regulate. The questions don't arrive gently or emotionally. They arrive sharp, mechanical, and relentless, cycling without resolution. Did I do something wrong? Did I miss a signal? Why didn't they argue? Why didn't they explain? Why didn't they try to stay? Silence doesn't respond. It strips away distraction, and without distraction, the mind becomes an interrogation room with no authority to end the trial. Conversations they once dismissed get replayed. Moments they skipped over because you were always available are suddenly re-examined. At 2 a.m, they scroll without direction, not searching for answers, just trying to dull the pressure building behind their eyes. Old messages get reopened. Ordinary lines are reread as if they might contain a hidden code. In casual settings, your name surfaces unexpectedly, and their body reacts before thought catches up. A pause, a tightening, a drop they didn't anticipate. This isn't missing you. It's examination. Silence doesn't debate like you did. It doesn't explain. It doesn't soften. It lets questions ricochet until something gives. And what destabilizes them most is that the direction of those questions shifts. At first, everything points at you. Then it turns inward. Why does this keep happening to me? Why do people leave? Why did I assume they'd stay this time? Why didn't I see it coming? This is where absence becomes dangerous to the ego. You were meant to be endless, always reachable, permanently accessible. Your silence breaks that expectation, and broken expectations demand explanation. But none arrives. The loop stays open. Every unanswered question increases psychological pressure because the mind cannot tolerate unfinished narratives. Sleep fragments. Focus degrades. Quiet stretches uncomfortably long. Noise stops helping. And slowly, without you doing anything at all, they're forced to sit with something they avoided for years. The possibility that your disappearance wasn't random. And that possibility leads straight back to them. Silence doesn't argue. It interrogates. Fixation doesn't begin with emotion. It begins with interruption. The moment answers disappear, the mind refuses to move forward, not out of attachment, but out of unfinished business. This is the natural outcome of everything that came before. Questions without answers don't fade. They accumulate. The brain is built to complete sequences, and when a narrative breaks mid-flow, attention clamps down until resolution appears. That's why unfinished stories linger. Think of a TV series that vanished without a final season. No ending, no explanation. Years later, people still debate it, replay scenes, speculate endlessly, not because it was brilliant, but because it never closed. Your disappearance triggers the same mechanism. You don't settle into memory. You suspend the system. You become a question mark. They replay the last interaction, not with longing, but with urgency, searching for a signal that explains everything. They monitor timelines, shared connections, subtle cues, not because they want you back, but because the mind demands completion. This is where most people misunderstand kindness. They assume closure is compassion. It isn't. Closure is anesthesia. It calms the system, allows self-justification, and permits forgetting. When you offer no explanation, the loop stays open, and open loops hijack attention. That's why you surface at random moments, not emotionally, but cognitively, like an unresolved error message. The brain wants an ending so it can file the experience away, and you've denied it one. That denial isn't cruelty, it's consequence. They aren't preoccupied with you as a person. They're trapped inside a process that never finished. You've become the variable they can't solve. Every unanswered question tightens the loop. Why didn't you explain? Why no reason? Why did it stop like this? The quieter you stay, the louder the pressure grows. This is the point where absence stops being emotional and becomes mechanical. An unfinished loop drains mental bandwidth, fragments sleep, and resurfaces during idle moments because the mind cannot tolerate loose ends. And here's the uncomfortable reality. If you had explained yourself, they would have felt relieved, justified, or absolved, and you would have been archived. By saying nothing, you remain unresolved. If that discomfort is rising, don't rush to silence it. Notice how often you were trained to give closure for someone else's peace. What comes next shows how this open loop doesn't just hold attention. It rewrites value. Closure is permission to forget. When answers never arrive, the mind doesn't sit quietly with the discomfort. It looks for relief. And that's where storytelling begins. This follows naturally from the open loop before, because an ego can't survive long without a narrative that explains away its unease. When silence offers nothing, the brain fills the gap on its own. They start constructing a version of you that makes the situation bearable. You were unstable. You were dramatic. You left to get attention. You didn't matter that much anyway. These explanations aren't meant to understand you. They're meant to numb responsibility. Acknowledging that they undervalued someone consistent, patient, and present would require a level of self-examination the ego avoids at all costs. So the story shifts. The past gets revised. Your reliability turns into neediness. Your restraint becomes manipulation. Your boundaries are reframed as defects. But these stories are delicate. They don't stand on their own. They have to be defended, repeated, reinforced. Every time your name comes up, the narrative gets rehearsed. Every time a memory surfaces that doesn't fit, the story has to be reworked. That upkeep drains energy. Mental effort is spent propping up a fiction, and that's where pressure accumulates. Publicly, they may insist they're better off, that it ended for the best, that nothing valuable was lost. Privately, the story shakes. Reality seeps through in small ways, familiar places, shared references, moments when your absence weighs more than the explanation they practiced. This isn't healing, it's coping. The mind prefers a comfortable lie to a painful truth. And the truth they're avoiding is simple. You didn't disappear because you were unstable. You disappeared because the structure was. The more they repeat the story, the more attached they become to it, because letting it go would mean confronting their role in losing you. That's why the narrative grows louder with time instead of fading. Pride demands protection. Truth does not. Myths exist to protect pride, not truth. After the story is set, something undermines it. The narrative can repeat itself, but memory doesn't take orders. This follows directly from the myth they constructed, because no explanation, no matter how convincing, can override involuntary recall. You begin to surface without permission. A scent in a corridor triggers a reaction before thought has time to catch up. A familiar phrase leaves someone else's mouth, and their body tightens instantly. Songs, locations, routines become signals they never agreed to receive. This isn't missing you, it's intrusion. Psychologists call it intrusive recall, moments when memory bypasses intention and pushes forward on its own schedule. They can't anticipate it. They can't prepare for it. It shows up while driving, showering, waiting in line, and it ignores whatever story they rehearsed to stay comfortable. The narrative insists you were unstable. The body remembers steadiness. The narrative claims you didn't matter. The nervous system remembers regulation. This is where absence becomes something else entirely. A ghost. You're absent in reality, yet present across their internal landscape. They may believe they've moved on. They may say your name lightly, without emphasis. And then it happens. A laugh sounds familiar. A sentence lands with the same rhythm you used to have. For a brief moment, the story collapses and reality cuts through. That moment doesn't need to last. Repetition does the work. Each unplanned reminder weakens the narrative they work to maintain. This ties back to the open loop, because unfinished processes don't disappear, they return. It also ties back to the system failure, because the stabilizing element is still missing. They try to substitute you with noise, with new connections, with distraction. But the echo persists. It keeps resurfacing because they attempted to suppress it. Suppression strengthens recall. Every effort to forget adds friction, turning neutral moments into reminders, until moving on requires more effort than facing what silence already revealed inside. You aren't haunting them deliberately. You're haunting them structurally. You left in the physical sense. You remained psychologically. And that contradiction is draining, because there's no way to argue with a memory that arrives uninvited. Once the ghost becomes familiar, a heavier realization sets in. Not affection, not yearning, reassessment. This follows naturally from the phantom presence, because memory forces comparison whether they want it to or not. When you were around, you were inexpensive, easy to reach, consistently available, and the mind valued you accordingly. When you disappear, the system recalibrates. This isn't emotional, it's economic. They don't suddenly want you back because feelings resurfaced. They reevaluate because absence reveals cost. They begin noticing what quietly vanished with you. The steadiness that's missing. The problems that no longer resolve themselves. The emotional maintenance no one is doing anymore. That's when the realization forms, slowly and painfully. I misjudged their value. Not because you changed, but because the conditions did. Worth was always present. It just stayed invisible under unlimited access. That's why regret shows up late. It isn't loud or dramatic. It's precise, calculated. They recognize the distance between what they invested and what they lost, and that distance doesn't shrink. Markets don't reopen simply because someone finally understands their error. You carried more value than they accounted for, and they spent you as if you were replaceable. This awareness doesn't provoke action. It produces weight, a persistent heaviness that appears when things unravel and there's no one left to absorb the fallout. Pride goes silent here, because pride has no argument against numbers. The ledger ignores intent. It only reflects results, and the result is straightforward. Life becomes more expensive without what they assumed would always be there. They don't miss you for who you were. They miss you for what stopped functioning without you. By the time the cost becomes clear, access is already withdrawn. And that leaves one question behind. If you've ever wondered why people only recognize your value after you're gone, this is the reason. The decision now isn't whether they see it. It's whether you're willing to reduce the price again just to be welcomed back. You were never worthless. You were underpriced. If you still think this was something done to them, you're looking at it from the wrong angle. None of this was moving toward retaliation. It was guiding you toward clarity. Disappearing wasn't a signal meant to wound. It was a choice meant to stop damage. That distinction matters, because punishment keeps your focus tied to the person who benefited from your depletion, while self-protection redirects it back to where it belongs. The moment you recognize the real cost, staying stopped being loyalty and became self-erasure. Leaving didn't require anger or drama. It required precision. You didn't walk away to make a statement. You walked away because the system only functioned when you continued absorbing chaos, regulating emotions, and quietly shrinking so others could remain comfortable. Removing yourself wasn't theatrical. It was maintenance. Corrective, necessary. Think about how unnatural it felt to stop explaining yourself, to stop smoothing tension, to stop waiting for permission to prioritize yourself. That discomfort isn't guilt. It's the sensation of stepping out of a role you were conditioned to perform. You were rewarded for patience, praised for understanding, and silently expected to give without limit. Leaving disrupts that conditioning. That's why it can feel wrong at first, But unfamiliar doesn't mean unethical. It means new. Self-protection always looks aggressive to those who depended on your absence of it. This isn't about becoming cold or distant. It's about accuracy. Accuracy with your time, with your attention, with what you allow access to your nervous system. When you stop labeling your absence as revenge, it stops anchoring you to the past and starts creating space ahead. No rehearsed explanations, no tracking reactions, no checking whether the message landed. Just distance, clean, quiet. And inside that distance, something changes. You're no longer defined by how needed you are. You're defined by what you choose to protect. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. Everything converges at this point, because once you stop labeling distance as revenge and start inhabiting it as correction, a different form of power settles in. It's subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't hurry. They might return. Not with apologies, not with insight. Sometimes it's a message long after the silence. Sometimes it's a reaction, a casual check-in dressed as concern, a quiet signal that access still exists if you allow it. But when that moment arrives, you're no longer who they remember. You've already crossed the most difficult threshold, the one most people retreat from, remaining gone. That's where the real decision begins. You can reopen the door and restart the cycle, restore access, take back the role of absorbing chaos and call it optimism. Or you can acknowledge what shifted inside you when you stopped chasing resolution. You felt what calm actually feels like, when your nervous system isn't waiting for disruption. You noticed how much room returned when you weren't managing someone else's emotional weather. You learned that availability and respect are not the same thing. This isn't about withholding to punish. It's about preserving structure to protect yourself. Power doesn't come from leaving once. It comes from not returning simply because curiosity reappears. Most people collapse here. They confuse attention with accountability. They hear a familiar tone and forget the price they paid. They reopen access and are surprised when nothing improves. Staying gone isn't harsh. It's disciplined. It asks you to trust what you learned instead of what you miss. And that discipline reshapes how you move everywhere else. You stop over-explaining. You stop bargaining for worth. You stop using availability as a stand-in for value. If you're still here, don't ask whether they deserve another opportunity. Ask whether you're willing to surrender the clarity you earned just to return to familiarity. This isn't a call to harden yourself. It's a call to choose precision over repetition. If this lands, hold it quietly. Apply it without performance. Let absence accomplish what words never did. You cannot force value, but you can remove access.